A single misplaced message can unravel the careful boundaries people build around their lives, exposing truths never meant to surface. In one careless moment, a private confession meant for a trusted friend slips into the worst possible hands, turning an ordinary evening into the beginning of something irreversible. Emma Collins never imagined that her most guarded secret would escape so easily. One quiet Thursday night in Boston, she lay curled on her couch, wrapped in comfort and routine, unaware that everything was about to change. Rain tapped steadily against the windows, a half-finished container of Thai takeout sat on the table, and a cheap glass of wine balanced dangerously close to the edge. It was the kind of night built for harmless conversations and unfiltered honesty. Her phone buzzed again with messages from Jess, her closest friend despite the distance between them. Their conversation drifted between jokes, gossip, and the kind of confessions reserved for late hours when judgment feels far away. The topic turned, as it often did, to Emma's hopeless attraction to her boss, Rachel Hart. It was a crush she had tried to bury under professionalism, convincing herself it was nothing more than admiration. That illusion had never held. Rachel was everything Emma wasn't: composed, commanding, effortlessly brilliant. She carried herself with precision, her words sharp and deliberate, her presence impossible to ignore. Every detail about her seemed controlled, from the tailored blazers she wore like armor to the quiet tilt of her head when she listened. Working under her for months had only made the situation worse, turning fleeting admiration into something far more dangerous. The conversation with Jess grew playful, teasing the boundaries Emma tried so hard to maintain. Without thinking, she searched her camera roll and found a meme that perfectly captured her situation: dramatic, exaggerated, safely hidden behind humor. It felt harmless enough. A joke, a way to laugh at something she could never admit seriously. She sent it instantly, adding her own words without hesitation: her boss was her weakness. And the whole thing felt pathetic. The message disappeared into the digital void, and Emma leaned back, expecting the usual teasing response. Silence followed instead. Then came the notification that changed everything. The message had not gone to Jess. It had gone to Rachel. The realization struck with a cold, suffocating weight. Emma stared at her screen, watching as the read receipt appeared. There was no undoing it, no rewriting the moment. What had once been a private joke now sat in a conversation thread that had always been strictly professional, surrounded by meeting times and formal updates. The contrast made it unbearable. Her hands trembled as panic set in. Every possible consequence rushed through her mind at once: humiliation, termination, the collapse of everything she had worked for. She searched desperately for a way to fix it, to erase it, to pretend it had never happened. Nothing worked. The message remained unmovable and undeniable. The seconds stretched into minutes as she watched the typing indicator appear and disappear, over and over again. Rachel was reading, thinking, responding, then stopping. The silence that followed felt heavier than any immediate reaction could have been. Hours passed in restless anxiety. Apologies were drafted and deleted, each one sounding worse than the last. Excuses felt hollow, lies felt obvious, and the truth was far too exposed to disguise. Eventually, exhaustion replaced panic, and Emma could do nothing but sit with the consequences of a single mistake. Late into the night, just as sleep finally began to pull her under, her phone buzzed again. A message from Rachel. 4 words in your mind. The simplicity of it made it impossible to interpret. It carried no explanation, no context, no safety. It could have been humor, deflection, or something far more real. Emma read it again and again, searching for certainty where none existed. Her thoughts spiraled through every possibility. Doubt clashed with hope, fear tangled with disbelief. The words lingered, unresolved, refusing to settle into meaning. Sleep never truly came that night, only fragments of restless thinking and unanswered questions. By Monday morning, the weight of those 4 words had only grown heavier. Standing outside the office building, coffee in hand, Emma felt as though she were stepping toward a verdict she didn't understand. Around her, everything remained normal. Coworkers arriving, conversations beginning, the steady rhythm of routine continuing unchanged. Inside, however, nothing felt the same. The elevator ride stretched endlessly, each floor bringing her closer to whatever awaited. The office buzzed with its usual energy, oblivious to the quiet storm unfolding beneath her composed exterior. She moved through it carefully, forcing herself into routine, pretending that nothing had shifted. From her desk, she could see Rachel's office clearly. Rachel sat exactly as she always did, calm, focused, perfectly put together. No sign of disruption, no hint of what had passed between them. She looked untouchable, as if the message had never existed. And yet, everything had already changed. She appeared exactly as she always did, composed, controlled, untouched by anything that might blur the strict lines of professionalism. There was no trace of a late-night message, no hint of anything personal slipping through the cracks. She looked like someone who would never allow boundaries to shift. Never let something as reckless as an accidental confession linger in her world. Emma tried to lose herself in work, clinging to routine as a form of stability. A campaign launch loomed ahead, deadlines stacked one after another, responsibilities demanding focus. None of it held her attention for long. Her concentration fractured every few minutes, her gaze drifting toward Rachel's office as if the answer to everything might be hidden in the smallest gesture. At 115, Rachel stood to refill her coffee. Emma immediately buried herself in her screen, fingers moving without purpose across the keyboard, creating the illusion of productivity. From the corner of her vision, she caught the quiet, effortless movement as Rachel passed by. The faint trace of her perfume lingered behind her, subtle, expensive, distracting enough to pull Emma out of thought entirely. Time stretched, each minute thick with anticipation, until the sharp ping of an instant message cut through the tension. Rachel's name appeared on the screen, followed by a simple request to talk in her office. The words were neutral, professional, but they carried a weight that made Emma's pulse stutter. This was the moment she had been both fearing and waiting for. Her reply came automatically, her body moving before her mind could catch up. The short walk to Rachel's office felt endless, every step echoing louder than it should, every sound around her amplified. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, conversations blending into a steady hum, but none of it felt real. The door was open, but she knocked anyway, buying herself a few extra seconds. Rachel's voice came without hesitation, calm and steady, instructing her to come in and close the door. The quiet click of the door shutting behind her seemed to seal the moment in place. She had sat in this office many times before, discussing projects, reviewing strategies, proving her worth. This time the air felt different, heavier with something unspoken. She took the same seat across the desk, her posture rigid, her thoughts racing ahead of her. Rachel finished what she was doing, closed her laptop, and finally looked at her. That familiar reaction sparked instantly, the one Emma had spent months trying to ignore. It was still there, undeniable, unmanageable. Rachel's expression revealed nothing at first. No anger, no amusement, no discomfort. Only focus, as if she were approaching this the way she approached everything else, with precision and intent. When she spoke, her tone was measured, almost reflective, acknowledging the message from Friday night without dramatics. The calmness only made it harder to breathe. Emma's apology came out in a rush, words tumbling over each other, an attempt to fix something that couldn't be undone. The explanation followed just as quickly, wrong recipient, careless moment, harmless joke that had turned into something else entirely. Embarrassment burned through every sentence. Rachel stopped her gently, cutting through the spiral of apologies with a quiet firmness that demanded attention. The shift in tone changed everything. It wasn't reprimand. It wasn't dismissal. It was something else. Emma forced herself to be still, to listen. Rachel repeated the key detail. The message hadn't been meant for her. The words hung in the air, acknowledged but not judged. Then came something unexpected. A confession of her own, carefully delivered, each word chosen with intention. She had rewritten her response multiple times. That alone was enough to unsettle everything Emma had assumed. It meant thought, hesitation, conflict. It meant the message had mattered. Rachel made it clear that her reply had not been a joke, nor an attempt to embarrass. The reassurance settled between them, heavy with implication, shifting the entire conversation into unfamiliar territory. Silence followed, thick and charged, until the truth finally surfaced. It had been real. The simplicity of it stripped away any remaining distance. The words were quiet, almost understated, but they carried a weight that changed everything. For the first time, the carefully maintained barrier between them cracked, revealing something unguarded beneath. Rachel looked different in that moment. The certainty that defined her seemed to soften, replaced by something more human, more uncertain. The controlled composure gave way just enough to reveal vulnerability. Then came the explanation, slow, deliberate, undeniable. Admiration had never been the full story. It had grown into something else, something harder to ignore with time. The small details had mattered. The way Emma approached her work, the way she treated people, the quiet warmth she brought into spaces that didn't always deserve it. Those things had been noticed, remembered, held onto. The confession deepened, moving beyond professional respect into something undeniably personal. Observations that should have gone unspoken were laid bare, moments watched, expressions memorized, small habits that had somehow become significant. Rachel had been aware of it for longer than she had allowed herself to admit. The message from Friday night had not created something new. It had simply exposed what had already been there. Relief had followed. Relief that the feeling might not be one-sided. Relief that what had seemed impossible might not be entirely out of reach. Emma felt untethered, as if the ground beneath her had shifted into something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. The situation that had once felt like a mistake now revealed itself as something else entirely. Rachel didn't hide from it anymore. She spoke openly about the internal conflict, the attempts to rationalize, to maintain control, to keep everything safely within the limits of professionalism. Each justification had eventually fallen apart under the weight of something more honest. By the time she had sent that message, the decision had already been made. There was no pretending left. What remained was the truth, laid out plainly, impossible to take back. She noticed everything, and the way she said it carried more weight than any long explanation ever could. It wasn't casual awareness or the distant attentiveness of a manager keeping track of her team. It was something deliberate, something personal. something that had been building quietly in the background long before either of them acknowledged it out loud. Her gaze lingered with a mix of fondness and quiet frustration, as though she were both amused by herself and slightly exasperated by how far things had gone without being spoken. The details began to surface one by one, moments that had once seemed ordinary now rearranging themselves into something far more intimate. There had been that afternoon when stress had been written all over Emma's face, when the pressure of a project had started to show in ways she thought she had hidden well. Rachel had shifted her entire schedule without hesitation, creating space for a simple coffee break that had felt like unexpected kindness at the time. It had meant more than Emma realized then, and now it stood revealed as something intentional, something chosen. Then there was the presentation that had kept Emma awake for nights, the one that had felt like a test she might fail. Rachel had shown up prepared, steady, quietly reinforcing every point that needed support, making sure nothing slipped. It had felt like strong leadership, like the steady hand of someone who knew how to guide a team. Now it felt different, closer, more personal, threaded with care that went beyond responsibility. All those moments Emma had filed away as professionalism began to shift their meaning. They weren't random acts of a good manager. They were choices, repeated and deliberate. Rachel admitted it without dramatics, acknowledging the effort it took to stay within boundaries that had never felt entirely solid. She had tried to remain appropriate, to keep everything contained within the expectations of her role, but even within those limits, lines had blurred in small, almost invisible ways. Those lines showed up in the details. Extra attention given where it wasn't strictly necessary. Opportunities shaped with quiet intention. Preferences remembered without ever being stated aloud. Something as small as keeping better coffee stocked in her office suddenly carried a different meaning, turning from a trivial convenience into a quiet gesture of thoughtfulness that had been there all along. The realization landed with a strange mix of disbelief and clarity. What had seemed one-sided, hidden safely behind careful distance, had been mirrored on the other side just as strongly, just as quietly. The absurdity of it broke through the tension, and laughter followed, light and almost disbelieving. Months of restraint, of carefully maintained professionalism, undone by a single misplaced message. All the restraint, all the discipline, all the effort to keep things unspoken, and in the end it had taken something accidental to bring everything into the open. Rachel didn't shy away from grounding the moment. She made it clear that none of this had anything to do with merit or achievement. Emma's place had been earned, her work recognized independently of anything personal. That truth stood firm, untouched by whatever existed between them now. What lay ahead, however, remained uncertain. There was no script for this, no clear path to follow. Rachel admitted as much, her honesty stripping away any illusion of control. This wasn't a situation she had planned for or even allowed herself to consider seriously. It had existed in the background, carefully managed, deliberately ignored. Now it was impossible to ignore, and despite everything, the complications, the risks, the potential consequences, there was no hesitation in what she felt about it anymore. She wanted it. The admission settled between them, steady and undeniable. It wasn't impulsive or reckless. It came with full awareness of how complicated things could become, how easily everything could shift into something messy and difficult. None of that erased the truth of it. Emma saw her differently in that moment, not as the untouchable figure who moved through the office with effortless control, but as someone allowing herself to be seen fully for the first time. The composure was still there, but beneath it was something softer, something hopeful that hadn't been given space before. The answer to what came next wasn't immediate. It wasn't something that could be solved in a single conversation. It would take time, understanding, and choices neither of them had prepared for. Rachel moved toward the window, the city stretching out beyond the glass, light catching in subtle strands of her hair that had gone unnoticed before. She stood there quietly, as if gathering the last pieces of something she had held back for too long. When she turned back, there was more to say. This hadn't begun with that message. It hadn't even begun recently. The timeline stretched further back, into a moment Emma hadn't considered significant at the time but had clearly left a lasting impression. Rachel spoke of that early presentation, the one that had felt like a trial by fire. Emma remembered the nerves, the sleepless nights, the desperate effort to prove she belonged. She hadn't known she was being watched so closely, that someone had been paying attention not just to the work but to the way she carried herself through it. What had stood out hadn't been only the ideas, though those had been impossible to ignore. It had been the energy, the confidence that surfaced despite the pressure, the way she came alive while explaining something she believed in. That had been the moment something shifted. Curiosity had followed first, framed as professional interest, a reason to look deeper, to understand where that kind of thinking came from. It had been easy to justify at the time, easy to label as part of leadership, part of recognizing potential. It hadn't stayed that simple. Attraction had settled in quietly, uninvited but persistent. It had grown in the background, shaped by proximity, by shared moments, by the slow accumulation of details that became impossible to ignore. Rachel admitted how long she had tried to suppress it, how carefully she had worked to keep it contained. Supporting the promotion had been the clearest example of that restraint, choosing what was right over what was easier, even knowing it would make everything more complicated. Working closely had only intensified everything she had been trying to control. Every meeting, every shared project, every small interaction added weight to something she was determined not to acknowledge. And yet it had never disappeared. Now, standing there without the shield of distance, she allowed the truth to exist without resistance. The effort to deny it was gone, replaced by something more honest, something that no longer needed to be hidden. Her composure had softened completely, the carefully constructed exterior giving way to something unguarded. Even her laughter carried a different tone now, lighter, freer, shaped by the relief of finally saying what had been held back for too long. Maintaining distance had never really worked. It had only disguised how much she noticed, how much she cared, how much every small detail mattered, and in the end, none of it had stayed hidden. The details spilled out with a quiet intensity, each one too precise to be accidental. She had been paying attention in ways that went far beyond observation, noticing the smallest habits as if they mattered. The way concentration showed itself in a subtle bite of the lip, the consistency of a simple lunch order, the faint crease that appeared between brows when worry settled in. None of it was remarkable on its own, yet together it formed something deeply personal, a pattern only someone truly watching would ever see. Emma felt the same recognition rise in return, the balance shifting naturally as she spoke. The soft, absent-minded hum that slipped out when Rachel thought no one was listening, the way she chose stairs over elevators when stress pressed in, the unconscious motion of tucking her hair behind her ear while reading emails. These weren't things someone noticed from a distance. They came from proximity, from attention that lingered longer than it should. The space between them seemed to shrink with every word. Rachel stepped closer, closing the distance until the air itself felt charged. There was no hesitation left in her voice now, no careful filtering of meaning. Everything she had held back surfaced plainly. She had been lost in it from the beginning. Every decision, every opportunity, every late evening that stretched longer than necessary had carried intention beneath its professional surface. What had looked like mentorship, like strategic guidance, had been shaped by something far more personal. It had been the only way she could justify staying close, the only version of proximity that made sense within the structure she was bound to uphold. The truth of it rested heavily between them. Titles, roles, expectations, those lines had always been there, clearly defined, impossible to ignore. She had respected them, even when it meant denying something that refused to disappear. Admitting how much she had wanted more seemed to catch even her off guard. The honesty came out unfiltered, carrying the weight of every moment she had chosen restraint over instinct. The impulse had been there repeatedly, surfacing in quiet opportunities that could have been something else entirely. Each time she had stepped back, choosing control over desire, Emma felt the impact of it all at once, a warmth rising behind her eyes that had nothing to do with sadness. It was the realization of something mutual, something that had existed in parallel without either of them fully seeing it. Rachel's voice softened as she explained why it had remained hidden. Responsibility had dictated everything. The need to protect, to ensure fairness, to keep personal feelings from interfering with something as important as a career. It had never been about indifference. It had been about restraint. Now that restraint was being questioned. The effort to bury everything had not made it disappear. It had only made it heavier, turning something natural into something exhausting. The possibility that it had been visible all along lingered briefly, but Emma's immediate certainty erased that doubt. Nothing had been obvious. What Rachel had hidden, she had hidden well. The realization that both of them had been navigating the same quiet struggle broke something open. Laughter followed, real and unrestrained, cutting through months of tension with a kind of disbelief. All that careful distance, all that effort to remain composed, and beneath it both of them had been carrying the same unspoken truth. It felt almost absurd, yet within that absurdity was clarity. The path forward needed to be deliberate. Rachel's tone shifted again, not away from what she felt, but toward how it needed to be handled. There was a right way to move forward, one that acknowledged both the reality of their situation and the structure they existed within. Transparency, accountability, and care for what they had built professionally would have to come first. And beyond that, something simple. The idea of stepping outside that structure, even briefly, carried a different kind of weight now. Not hidden, not accidental, but chosen. The silence that followed held none of the earlier tension. It felt open, steady, filled with something that hadn't existed before. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed, but inside that room, everything had shifted into something new. Emma saw her differently now, not just as the composed figure who led with certainty, but as someone willing to stand in uncertainty without stepping away from it. The intelligence, the presence, the confidence, all of it remained. But now there was warmth threaded through it, something accessible that made her feel closer instead of distant. The truth of her own feelings came just as quietly. What had been hidden behind humor and deflection no longer needed to be disguised. It had always been real, even when it had been easier to pretend otherwise. Rachel understood immediately. There was no surprise, only recognition. Some things didn't need explanation when they had been felt from both sides all along. She moved her chair, removing the barrier that had always existed between them, replacing distance with something more direct. The shift was small but meaningful, changing the dynamic without a single word. When she spoke again, her voice carried a softer edge, something more tentative than before. She wanted to understand the timeline, to trace the moment when everything had begun to change. Emma let herself go back to it, to the earliest memory that still stood clear. The first week had been overwhelming, filled with mistakes and doubt, the kind of beginning that made confidence feel fragile. She had stayed late, trying to fix what felt unfixable, convinced she had already failed. Rachel had stayed too, not out of obligation, not out of necessity, but out of something that felt different even then. Food had appeared, conversation had followed, and what had felt like failure had slowly turned into something manageable. At the time it had been interpreted as kindness, as good leadership. Now it stood revealed as something more. That night had lingered longer than it should have, not because of the work, but because of how it had felt. The ease, the support, the quiet reassurance that things could be handled. It had left an impression that didn't fade. Rachel admitted the truth of that moment without hesitation. It hadn't been routine, hadn't been something she did for everyone. It had been personal from the beginning, even if she hadn't allowed herself to name it. Everything that followed had grown from there. The recognition settled between them, undeniable now. Months of silence, of restraint, of carefully controlled distance, all leading to this moment where nothing needed to be hidden anymore. Even the smallest memories took on new meaning. A late night problem solved, a quiet moment of pride, a glance that lingered just a second too long. Each one had carried something unspoken at the time, something that now made perfect sense. Rachel's final admission came with a trace of embarrassment, but she didn't pull back from it. Watching Emma work, seeing her think, witnessing the moment something clicked, that had been enough to leave her unsettled in ways she hadn't expected. Attraction hadn't been separate from admiration. It had been intertwined with it, growing stronger each time Emma revealed another layer of who she was. And when that realization had become too difficult to ignore, she had stepped away, not because she didn't feel it, but because she felt it too clearly. Now there was no stepping away left. The word landed without hesitation, simple and unguarded, and for a moment everything seemed to stop around it. It carried no embellishment, no attempt to soften its meaning. It was direct, honest, impossible to misunderstand. The air between them shifted, charged with something that had been building for far too long to remain contained. Her voice stayed calm, almost steady, but beneath it was a current that betrayed how much restraint it had taken to hold this back. The admission wasn't sudden. It had been there in fragments, in moments that had required discipline to move past, in instincts that had been suppressed before they could take shape. Every time Emma's excitement lit up her face, every time focus pulled her into that quiet habit of concentration, every time she listened with that full, undivided attention, something inside Rachel had pushed against the limits she had set for herself. Those limits had always been clear. They had to be. Titles, responsibilities, expectations, none of it allowed for the kind of feelings she was describing. She had reminded herself of that constantly, using it as an anchor whenever things threatened to drift too far. Still, wanting had never really stopped. It had grown quietly, becoming harder to ignore with each passing interaction. Eventually, even proximity had become difficult to manage. Conversations that once stretched comfortably began to shrink, reduced to essentials, carefully contained. What had seemed like efficiency had actually been avoidance, a way to maintain control when control felt fragile. Emma saw it clearly now, the pattern that hadn't made sense before. Distance had not been indifference. It had been protection, not just for one of them but for both. Rachel didn't hide behind experience or logic, even though she had plenty of both. Years in structured environments had taught her exactly why situations like this were complicated, why boundaries existed, why crossing them could create consequences that reached far beyond two people. None of that knowledge had been enough to quiet what she felt. It had only made the conflict sharper. Every small detail about Emma seemed to stand out in ways that defied explanation. The quiet generosity, the instinct to help without being asked, the way she made even the most overlooked people feel seen. It wasn't just attraction. It was something layered, something built from admiration, respect, and something deeper that refused to stay unnamed. Attempts to reduce it to something simpler had failed. Professional respect couldn't explain why certain sounds lingered in memory, why certain moments were anticipated before they happened, why presence alone could shift the rhythm of an entire day. The truth had settled in gradually, undeniable once it was fully acknowledged. It extended beyond the office, beyond projects and deadlines into thoughts of something quieter, more personal. Conversations that had nothing to do with strategy or outcomes. Moments where roles didn't define interaction. A version of knowing each other that had never been allowed space before. When Emma spoke about her childhood dream, the shift felt natural, as if the conversation had already begun moving in that direction long before either of them realized it. The detail fit perfectly into the pattern Rachel had been quietly collecting, another piece she had noticed without ever mentioning. Nothing about that awareness was accidental. It had been built over time, through observation that had become second nature. Even something as small as a screensaver had been enough to reveal a preference, a quiet connection to something beyond the present. It wasn't just seen. It was remembered. The weight of all of it settled gently, fragile but real. There was no pretense left, no carefully maintained distance to retreat behind. What remained was something exposed, something that required care simply because of how much it meant. Rachel's composure had shifted entirely. The certainty that once defined her had softened into something more vulnerable, something that carried the risk of being understood or rejected in equal measure. She watched closely, not for judgment but for recognition. Practical reality still existed, impossible to ignore. Roles hadn't disappeared just because the truth had been spoken. The structure around them remained intact, filled with expectations and consequences that couldn't simply be set aside. She had thought about all of it, turning it over repeatedly, weighing what it could mean, what it could cost. The question that remained wasn't about whether it was complicated. That much was obvious. It was about whether it mattered enough to face those complications head-on. For a long time, she had convinced herself that it didn't. That it was easier to stay within the lines, safer to ignore what couldn't be easily resolved. That decision had felt responsible, even necessary. It hadn't felt right. What had started as discipline had slowly turned into something heavier, something that drained more than it protected. Ignoring it hadn't made it disappear. It had only made it more present, more persistent, more difficult to carry. Now, with everything laid bare, that answer had changed. What she felt no longer seemed small enough to dismiss. It felt real in a way that cut through logic, through habit, through every reason she had given herself to keep it contained. It felt significant enough to question everything she had once accepted as unchangeable. And beneath that realization, something even deeper surfaced. This wasn't a familiar pattern repeating itself. It wasn't a situation she could compare to anything from her past. Even her previous relationship, steady and structured as it had been, had never carried this kind of intensity. It had been stable, predictable, built on expectations that made sense at the time. But it had lacked something she could now recognize clearly: connection. What had once seemed like the right kind of partnership had slowly faded into something distant, something functional rather than meaningful. The ending had come without drama, without conflict, simply because there had been nothing left to hold on to. That absence made the present feel sharper by contrast. What stood between them now was not quiet or routine. It was alive, uncertain, and undeniably real. It carried a kind of attention that went beyond surface, level understanding, a kind of care that showed itself in the smallest details. It made everything feel different. It made her want more than she had ever allowed herself to want before. The desire unfolded without hesitation, clear and unfiltered, carrying the weight of everything that had been held back for too long. It wasn't just about a single moment or a fleeting impulse. It stretched into something fuller, something that imagined time beyond the boundaries they had been confined to. A place where conversations weren't shaped by deadlines, where curiosity could exist without restraint, where attention could turn into something freely given instead of carefully managed. She spoke of simple things with an intensity that made them feel extraordinary. An afternoon at an aquarium, standing side by side while wonder replaced caution. The quiet anticipation of seeing joy unfold naturally, without the need to suppress it, and then something more direct, more undeniable, the wish to close the distance not as a formality or a fleeting mistake, but as a choice made without hesitation, grounded in everything she felt. Emma felt the pull of it immediately, not as something unfamiliar, but as something she had already been carrying in silence. The longing wasn't one-sided, and admitting it brought both relief and fear in equal measure. It wasn't the feeling itself that frightened her. It was everything that surrounded it, the structure they lived within, the consequences that could ripple outward. The risks were real, impossible to ignore. Reputation, perception, the fragile balance of professional trust, each one stood as a reminder of what could be lost if things didn't unfold carefully. Doubt surfaced not as resistance but as responsibility, as the instinct to protect what had already been built through effort and time. Rachel didn't dismiss those concerns. She met them directly, grounding the moment in something steady and certain. Merit had never been in question. Achievement had never been influenced by anything other than ability and dedication. That truth stood firm, regardless of how others might choose to interpret it. Still, perception was its own force, one that couldn't simply be controlled through intention. The reality of navigating that together became part of the path forward, not something to avoid, but something to face with clarity. Her approach shifted into something structured, thoughtful, the same precision she brought to every complex problem. There was a way to handle this without compromising everything else. Transparency, honesty, and a willingness to adapt would shape what came next. Adjustments might be necessary, boundaries redefined, roles reconsidered, but none of it felt impossible when placed against what they were acknowledging. What mattered was the choice, and the willingness to make it. Rachel's certainty didn't come from impulse. It came from the exhaustion of denying something that had only grown stronger with time. The questions she had carried for months had led nowhere, circling back to the same place again and again. Wondering had become its own kind of burden, heavier than the uncertainty of trying. Now there was no interest in holding back. What she felt had become too significant to dismiss, too real to reduce to convenience or caution. It demanded acknowledgement, demanded action, demanded honesty. Emma saw it clearly then, not just the words, but everything beneath them. The vulnerability, the risk, the quiet hope that hadn't been fully hidden despite every attempt. It wasn't just attraction or admiration. It was something deeper, something that reached into the way Rachel saw her, valued her, chose her. The realization brought its own clarity. What she felt wasn't surface level, wasn't fleeting. It had roots, built from moments that had mattered long before they were understood. It moved beyond admiration, beyond curiosity, into something that carried weight. Saying it aloud felt like crossing a threshold. The words came without hesitation once they began, each one revealing something that had been waiting beneath the surface. Appreciation turned into affection. Affection into something stronger, something that refused to be minimized. Every detail she spoke of, every quality she named built toward a truth that could no longer be softened. It wasn't just a passing feeling. It was something deeper, something that had already begun to take shape in ways she couldn't ignore. The certainty settled between them, steady and unshaken. Complications still existed, risk still remained, but they no longer felt like barriers strong enough to outweigh what had been revealed. Rachel moved closer, the distance between them disappearing entirely. When her hands reached out, the contact felt like something that had been imagined too many times to count, now finally real. It carried a quiet intensity, a connection that didn't need explanation. The question she asked wasn't casual. It carried weight, a final pause before everything shifted fully into something new. Emma's answer came without hesitation. There was no uncertainty left. What followed unfolded with a kind of clarity neither of them had expected. The conversation that might have felt daunting instead became structured, grounded, handled with the same professionalism they had always shown in every other challenge. Honesty replaced fear, and solutions emerged where obstacles had once seemed overwhelming. Adjustments were made, not as compromises, but as careful steps to protect both what they had built and what they were choosing to begin. Boundaries were redefined, roles shifted just enough to create space for something new without undermining what already existed. Time moved forward, carrying them into something unfamiliar but steady. The balance between professionalism and something more personal began to take shape naturally, not forced, not hidden but understood. Outside of work, everything felt lighter. Conversations stretched longer, moving beyond familiar territory into something more open. Stories replaced strategy, curiosity replaced caution. The connection that had once been restrained found room to grow without limits. And then, finally, a moment arrived that belonged entirely to them. No structure, no roles, no expectations beyond what they chose to bring into it. Standing there, on the edge of something new, the anticipation felt different from anything before it. Not uncertain, not fragile, but alive with possibility. When she appeared, there was no trace of the carefully constructed professional image that had once defined every interaction. What stood in front of Emma was something softer, something more open, something undeniably real. The familiarity remained, but it was layered now with something warmer, something that made every glance feel different. For a moment, neither of them needed to say anything. Everything that had led them there already spoke for itself. She spoke about it as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, yet every detail she revealed felt impossibly intimate. She had been paying attention in ways that went far beyond casual observation, noticing the smallest habits and quiet tells that most people would overlook. The way concentration made me bite my lip, the predictable order at lunch, the faint crease between my brows when something weighed on my mind. She had seen how I showed up for others, how I carried pieces of their lives with me, how I gave without being asked, and I realized I had been doing the same without ever naming it. I had noticed her too, the quiet hum she let slip when she thought no one was listening, the way stress sent her toward the stairs instead of the elevator, the absent gesture of tucking her hair behind her ear while reading emails. Those small, unguarded moments had stayed with me, distracting and grounding me all at once, until they became something I carried everywhere. The space between us shifted as she stepped closer, closing the distance that had always been carefully maintained. Her presence felt different now, no longer filtered through hierarchy or restraint. It was direct, undeniable. She admitted how long it had been like this for her, how everything she had done, every opportunity, every shared project, every late evening, had been shaped by a need to remain near me while still convincing herself it was justified. Duty had drawn the lines, but feeling had blurred them again and again. There had been rules, expectations, a structure designed to keep things clear and professional. She had held onto those boundaries because she believed she had to, because she knew the risks, because she understood the consequences better than either of us wanted to admit. And still, wanting had persisted beneath all of it, quiet but constant, growing in the spaces where logic failed to reach. She spoke about the effort it had taken to hold herself back, about the moments that nearly broke her resolve, about the discipline it required to keep distance when every instinct pushed her closer. Meetings shortened, conversations sharpened into necessity, everything trimmed down to avoid the weight of what lingered underneath. It had not been indifference. It had been protection of her position, of my future, of something neither of us fully understood yet. Time and experience had taught her caution, had given her every reason to walk away from something like this before it could begin. Yet none of that knowledge had dulled the reality of what she felt. It had only made the silence heavier, the restraint more deliberate, the longing harder to ignore. She saw everything. Not just the visible, not just the obvious, but the quiet ways I moved through the world, the things I gave without realizing, the impact I had without trying. She spoke about kindness not as a surface trait but as something rooted deeper, something that shaped how I existed around others. And in her voice there was no exaggeration, no performance, only certainty. She had tried to redefine it, to convince herself it was admiration, respect, professional appreciation. But those explanations had never been enough. They did not account for the way her attention followed me, the way her schedule bent around me, the way her thoughts drifted beyond work into something far more personal. They did not explain the imagined moments she carried, the quiet wishes that had nothing to do with offices or deadlines. She wanted to know me outside of all of it, not the version shaped by meetings and metrics, but the one that existed beyond those walls, the one with history, with dreams, with pieces of a life that had nothing to do with strategy or performance. And when I spoke about the things I once loved, the path I almost followed, she listened as if those details mattered just as much as anything I had ever accomplished. It was overwhelming in the gentlest way, the kind of attention that made everything feel seen, understood, held. She had been gathering these fragments of me for months, quietly, carefully, until they formed something whole in her mind, something she could no longer pretend was insignificant. The truth settled between us without urgency but with weight. This was not sudden, not impulsive, not the result of one careless moment. It had been building long before either of us acknowledged it, shaped by time, by proximity, by all the things left unsaid, and now there was no space left to hide it,